The silence stretched across the Tactical Operations Center like a death shroud. 27 screens flickered with thermal imagery, satellite feeds, and radio frequencies that had gone cold. The mission was hemorrhaging. 8 Navy SEALs trapped in a compound 30 clicks inside hostile territory, air support grounded by weather, and every extraction bird either shot down or bleeding fuel across the Afghan mountains. Commander Morrison's jaw worked wordlessly as he stared at the main display, watching heat signatures that represented America's finest slowly fade behind concrete walls. "Sir, we've lost Falcon 27, the comms specialist announced, his voice cracking slightly. "Bird took an RPG on final approach. No survivors." The room held its breath. Morrison's knuckles whitened against the aluminum rail separating him from the chaos unfolding on screen. 3 helicopters down. 2 fighter jets recalled due to zero visibility. The storm system had rolled in from nowhere, turning what should have been a routine extraction into a massacre. The SEALs had completed their objective, neutralizing a high-value target, but now they were paying the price for success. "Options?" Morrison barked. "None good, sir," his operations officer replied. "Weather's got everything grounded, visibility less than 50 meters. We can't get birds in there, and ground convoy would take 6 hours minimum. They don't have 6 hours." The tactical radio crackled with static. Through the white noise came a voice that shouldn't have been there, calm, measured, almost melodic despite the circumstances. "Control, this is Banshee Actual. I'm airborne and 5 minutes out from target area. Request permission to attempt extraction." Morrison's head snapped toward the radio operator. "Who the hell is Banshee Actual? We don't have any assets in that sector." The operator frantically worked his console, cross-referencing call signs and aircraft registrations. His face went pale. "Sir, according to the system, Banshee Actual was grounded 3 hours ago. Maintenance issues with her bird." "Then who's flying?" Morrison demanded. The voice returned, steady as mountain stone. "Control, Banshee Actual requesting immediate clearance for combat search and rescue. I have eyes on the compound. Weather's breaking up at Angels 5. I can get them out." Morrison grabbed the microphone. "Banshee Actual, identify yourself and your aircraft immediately." A pause, then, "Captain Kestrel Thorne flying a modified A-10C Thunderbolt. And before you ask, sir, yes, I took her without authorization. But those boys down there don't care about paperwork right now." The operations center fell silent. Every person in the room knew that call sign, knew that name. Banshee had been grounded not for maintenance, but for something far more controversial, and now she was flying into hell itself. Captain Kestrel Thorne had earned her wings in an era when female combat pilots were still fighting for legitimacy in every briefing room, every squadron, every mission. She'd graduated top of her class from the Air Force Academy, earned her wings through sheer determination, and proven herself in the cockpit time and again. But 3 weeks ago, everything changed during a mission over the Helmand province. The official report stated that Captain Thorne had deviated from her flight path to engage enemy targets without authorization, putting friendly forces at risk. The unofficial truth was more complicated. She'd spotted Taliban fighters moving to flank a Marine patrol and made a split-second decision to intervene. Her unauthorized gun run saved 16 Marines, but military protocol demanded consequences. She was grounded pending a formal review, her A-10 relegated to the maintenance hangar. But Kestrel Thorne wasn't the type to sit on the sidelines while good men died. She'd spent the last 3 weeks watching from the operations center, studying patterns, memorizing terrain, and feeling her heart break a little more each time a mission went sideways. Tonight, when the storm hit and every available aircraft was recalled, she'd made her choice. The maintenance chief owed her a favor from Kandahar, and her crew chief looked the other way when she signed out night vision equipment. By the time anyone realized what was happening, she was already wheels up and climbing into the storm. Her Thunderbolt II, nicknamed Warthog for its ungainly appearance, was designed for exactly this kind of mission. Close air support, ground attack. The plane could take punishment that would cripple other aircraft and still bring its pilot home, but flying it into a storm system that had already claimed 3 helicopters bordered on suicide. Banshee Actual, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Morrison's voice cut through the static. This is not your mission. Kestrel's response was measured, professional, and utterly immovable. With respect, sir, I'm already committed. I can see the compound through the cloud deck. 8 Marines are counting on someone to show up. I'm that someone. Through her cockpit canopy, the world was chaos. Lightning fractured the darkness while rain hammered against reinforced glass. Her instruments danced between normal and critical as wind shears tried to tear the aircraft apart. But beneath the storm, illuminated by brief flashes of lightning, she could see the compound where 8 Navy SEALs were making their last stand. The modified A-10C she flew wasn't standard issue. Over the years, she'd worked with mechanics and engineers to enhance its capabilities. Upgraded avionics, improved targeting systems, and a communication suite that allowed her to interface directly with ground forces. Tonight, all of those modifications would be tested against impossible odds. Her radio crackled with transmission from the trapped SEALs. The voice was strained, urgent. Any station, this is Gold 7 Actual. We are taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Request immediate close air support. We have wounded and are running low on ammunition. Kestrel keyed her microphone. Gold 7 Actual, this is Banshee Actual. I have you on thermal. Hold your position. Relief is inbound. Who is this? Came the reply. Control said no air support was available. Sometimes control is wrong, Kestrel replied, banking her aircraft toward the compound. Stand by for danger close support. Mark your position with infrared strobes. Below, through the storm and darkness, she could see muzzle flashes erupting around a square concrete building. The SEALs were trapped in the courtyard, pinned down by fighters positioned in surrounding buildings. It was a classic ambush, and without air support, it would be a massacre. But Kestrel Thorne had other plans. The first challenge was the weather itself. Visibility was near zero, wind speeds were gusting to 60 knots, and lightning strikes posed a constant threat to her aircraft's electronics. Standard operating procedure would have been to abort and wait for better conditions, but standard procedures didn't account for 8 men bleeding out in an Afghan courtyard. She activated her aircraft's advanced targeting pod, cycling through thermal and infrared spectrums until she could distinguish between friendly and hostile forces. The SEALs showed up as tight cluster in the compound's center, while enemy fighters occupied buildings to the north, east, and south. At least 30 hostiles, maybe more, all armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Gold 7 Actual, I count approximately 30 tangos in surrounding buildings. Can you confirm? Confirmed, Banshee. They've got us bracketed. We've taken 2 casualties, both stable but need immediate medical attention. We're down to maybe 10 minutes of ammunition at current rate. 10 minutes? Kestrel felt ice form in her stomach. The storm was still raging, making precision strikes incredibly dangerous. One miscalculation could kill the men she was trying to save, but doing nothing would guarantee their deaths. She began her approach, descending through layers of turbulence that threatened to tear her wings off. The A-10's titanium bathtub protecting her cockpit groaned under the stress, but held. At 3,000 feet, she acquired her first target, a building to the north where muzzle flashes revealed enemy positions. Gold 7 taking my first pass. Keep your heads down. The 13 GAU-8 Avenger cannon beneath her aircraft was a fearsome weapon, capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute. But in these conditions, with friendly forces danger close, precision was more important than firepower. She lined up her shot, compensating for wind drift and the aircraft's movement through the storm. The cannon roared to life, sending depleted uranium rounds into the northern building. Concrete and debris exploded outward as hostile fire from that position went silent. But return fire immediately erupted from the remaining positions, tracer rounds reaching up through the darkness like deadly fingers. "Good effect on target," came the radio call from below. "North side is quiet." But this was just the beginning. 2 more buildings still held enemy fighters, and she could see additional forces moving to reinforce them. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a full-scale battle, and she was fighting it alone in the middle of a storm that should have grounded every aircraft in theater. The second pass was more difficult. The enemy fighters had adjusted to her presence, and shoulder-fired missiles began streaking through the darkness. She deployed flares and chaff, banking hard to avoid the incoming threats while lining up her next target. G-forces pressed her into her ejection seat as she pulled the aircraft through maneuvers that pushed both machine and pilot to their limits. "Banshee Actual, you've got SAMs inbound," warned the SEAL team leader. "Multiple launches from your 9 o'clock." Kestrel could see them, bright dots rising through the storm, seeking the heat signature of her engines. She rolled inverted and dove, using the storm clouds as cover while her aircraft's defensive systems worked to defeat the incoming missiles. 2 passed harmlessly below her wings, but a third detonated close enough to rattle her teeth and spider-crack her starboard window. "Still here, Gold 7, she transmitted, pulling out of her dive and setting up for another attack run. "This is going to get interesting." But even as she spoke those words, Kestrel knew the situation was deteriorating rapidly. More enemy reinforcements were arriving, her fuel was burning at an alarming rate due to the aggressive maneuvering, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Worse, she could see additional missile teams setting up positions that would make future passes even more dangerous. In the Tactical Operations Center, Commander Morrison watched the impossible unfold on his screens. Thermal imagery showed a single aircraft dancing through surface-to-air missiles while providing precision close air support in weather conditions that should have been unsurvivable. Every military doctrine said this mission was impossible, yet somehow it was happening. "Sir," his operations officer said quietly, "she's actually doing it. The SEAL team is reporting effective fire on multiple targets, but she can't keep this up indefinitely." Morrison knew that. He also knew that by now, word of Captain Thorne's unauthorized mission had reached higher command levels. Phone calls were being made, careers were being discussed, and consequences were being calculated. But none of that mattered to the 8 men trapped in that compound, or to the pilot risking everything to save them. "Get me a direct line to Banshee Actual," he ordered. The radio operator made the connection. Morrison took the microphone and keyed the transmission. "Banshee Actual, this is Control. What's your fuel state?" Kestrel's reply came through bursts of static. "Control, I'm showing 30 minutes at current consumption, but I'm not leaving until those boys are safe." "Roger that, Banshee. Be advised, we're working on getting you some help. Heavy weather transport is attempting to reach your location." "Copy, Control, but don't wait for me if you get a window. These Marines have been through enough." Morrison found himself smiling despite the circumstances. Banshee had called them Marines, not SEALs. In the heat of combat, service branch distinctions disappeared. They were all just Americans in harm's way, and that was all that mattered to the pilot fighting to save them. But the enemy wasn't done. Intelligence reports began flooding in as analysts worked to understand what they were seeing on satellite feeds. This wasn't just a random ambush. It was a coordinated assault designed to draw American forces into a trap. The compound itself had been bait, and now additional enemy units were moving to exploit the situation. "Banshee Actual, Control. Be advised we're seeing reinforcements moving to your location from multiple directions. This looks like a coordinated offensive." Kestrel processed this information while lining up another gun run. The eastern building still held enemy fighters, and their fire was becoming more accurate. She could see rocket-propelled grenades arcing through the storm, and one had come close enough to her last pass to trigger proximity warnings. Copy Control. How many reinforcements are we talking about? Satellite shows at least 2 companies' worth of fighters, multiple vehicles, and what looks like heavy weapon systems. ETA to your location is approximately 15 minutes. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Even if she could neutralize the immediate threats around the compound, she couldn't engage 2 companies of enemy fighters by herself. The SEALs would need extraction before those reinforcements arrived, and in this weather, conventional extraction was still impossible. Unless someone tried something unprecedented. Control, Banshee Actual. I need you to coordinate with Gold 7 Actual for immediate extraction. I'm going to try something that's either brilliant or stupid. Banshee, explain your intentions. Kestrel was already working the problem in her mind. The A-10 was designed for close air support, not personnel recovery, but it was also one of the most rugged aircraft ever built, capable of operating from improvised airstrips and rough terrain. The compound's courtyard was approximately 40 meters square, tight for any aircraft, but maybe just large enough for what she had in mind. Control, I'm going to attempt a combat landing in the compound courtyard. Extract the SEAL team directly to my aircraft. The radio fell silent. Morrison stared at the tactical display, trying to process what he'd just heard. Landing an A-10 in a courtyard under fire in the middle of a storm was beyond dangerous. It was suicide. The aircraft wasn't designed to carry passengers, and even if the landing succeeded, takeoff would be nearly impossible. Banshee Actual negative on that plan. Too dangerous. Wait for proper extraction assets. Control, with respect, proper extraction assets aren't coming. Weather's getting worse, not better, and we've got company inbound. This is the only play. In the compound below, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rivera pressed himself against a concrete wall as bullets chipped away inches from his head. He'd been leading special operations missions for 12 years, and this was shaping up to be the worst yet. 2 of his men were wounded, ammunition was running critically low, and the enemy seemed to have unlimited reinforcements. But then he'd heard that voice on the radio, calm, confident, professional. Banshee Actual. He didn't know who was flying that A-10, but they were keeping his team alive with surgical precision that bordered on miraculous. Every gun run eliminated enemy positions without endangering his men, and the pilot's tactical awareness was better than most ground controllers he'd worked with. Now she was talking about landing in their courtyard. Banshee Actual, Gold 7 Actual. That courtyard is barely large enough for a helicopter, and we're still taking fire from multiple positions. Gold 7, I copy your concerns, but I can put this bird down anywhere there's 40 meters of flat ground. Question is, can you and your men clear the remaining hostiles while I set up for approach? Rivera looked around the courtyard, calculating angles and positions. His team was down to their last magazines, but they still had grenades and a few specialized munitions. If they coordinated their assault with the A-10's final gun runs, they might be able to clear enough space for the impossible landing the pilot was proposing. Banshee, give me 2 minutes to coordinate with my team. Then we'll light up everything we've got. Roger. Gold 7, 2 minutes. Kestrel used those 2 minutes to set up what would either be the most audacious rescue in military aviation history or the most spectacular failure. She climbed to 5,000 feet, giving herself room to configure the aircraft for landing while staying above the worst of the surface fire. The storm was actually helping now, providing cover for her approach, while the rain would help cool her engines during the landing sequence. The A-10's design included provisions for rough field operations, but nothing in the manual covered landing in a combat zone while under fire. She began running through emergency checklists, configuring systems for the shortest possible landing roll. Flaps down, landing gear extended, thrust reversers armed. Every setting optimized for stopping the aircraft in minimum distance. Gold 7 Actual Banshee, beginning final approach, light them up. Below, 8 Navy SEALs launched their final coordinated assault. Grenades flew toward enemy positions while suppressed rifle fire engaged targets of opportunity. The remaining A-10 gun runs eliminated the last organized resistance, leaving only scattered fighters who were more focused on survival than offensive action. But as Kestrel descended through the storm, she could see the advancing reinforcements. Headlights cutting through the darkness, moving fast toward the compound. Vehicle-mounted weapons and dismounted infantry, all converging on her location. Even if the landing succeeded, she'd have maybe 5 minutes before the compound was overrun. Control, Banshee Actual. I'm committed to landing. Requesting immediate support for extraction route planning. Morrison watched the thermal feed as the A-10 descended through layers of weather that should have been impossible to navigate. The aircraft appeared and disappeared in the clouds, buffeted by winds that would challenge much larger planes. But somehow, incredibly, it maintained course toward the compound. All stations, this is Control. Priority override on all frequencies. We have aircraft attempting combat landing for personnel recovery. Clear all airspace within 50 nautical miles for emergency support operations. The radio networks exploded with chatter as words spread throughout the theater. Pilots grounded by weather listened in disbelief as reports filtered in about an A-10 pilot attempting the impossible. Ground controllers began calculating support routes and extraction corridors. Medical teams prepared for incoming casualties. And somewhere in a Pentagon briefing room, senior officers began asking very pointed questions about who had authorized this mission. None of that mattered to Kestrel as she broke through the cloud deck at 800 feet. The compound spread out below her, illuminated by muzzle flashes and the occasional lightning strike. The courtyard looked impossibly small from her altitude, barely larger than her aircraft's wingspan. But she'd committed to this approach, and 8 men were counting on her to succeed. Gold 7, I have visual on the courtyard. Looks tight but doable. Be ready to move fast once I'm on the ground. Roger Banshee, we're ready. The approach was everything she'd expected and worse. Crosswinds tried to push her aircraft into the surrounding buildings, while updrafts and downdrafts made altitude control nearly impossible. She fought the controls with every ounce of skill accumulated over 8 years of military flying, keeping the aircraft aligned with the narrow courtyard while descending at angles that would have been considered reckless in perfect weather. At 200 feet, small arms fire began reaching up toward her aircraft. Tracer rounds zipped past her canopy, while the distinctive whoosh of rocket-propelled grenades filled the air. She deployed flares and chaff more from habit than tactical necessity. At this altitude and airspeed, she was committed to the landing regardless of incoming fire. 100 feet. The courtyard filled her entire field of view, concrete walls rising on all sides like the walls of a canyon. Her landing gear touched down hard, harder than any training manual would have allowed, and the aircraft bounced once before settling onto the improvised runway. Thrust reversers engaged, and she stood on the wheel brakes with everything the aircraft could provide. The A-10 Thunderbolt II came to a stop with less than 10 feet to spare. For a moment, silence filled the compound. The impossibility of what had just happened seemed to suspend disbelief itself. Then Chief Rivera's voice cut through the quiet. Move, move, move. Get to the aircraft. 8 Navy SEALs emerged from cover positions around the courtyard, carrying their wounded and providing covering fire as they bounded toward the stationary. Kestrel was already working the problem of how to fit 8 men into an aircraft designed for 1 pilot, but the A-10's cargo compartment behind the cockpit could accommodate additional personnel in extreme circumstances. Gold 7, I can take 6 of you in the cargo area. 2 will have to ride external on the wing hardpoints. Rivera didn't hesitate. Put the wounded inside. 2 of us will ride the wings. Loading the aircraft under fire tested everyone's nerves and training. The wounded SEALs were carefully positioned in the cargo compartment while 2 others strapped themselves to external hardpoints designed for ordnance, not passengers. It wasn't safe, it wasn't comfortable, and it probably violated every regulation in the book. But it was the only chance they had. Everyone loaded, Rivera reported, taking his position on the starboard wing. We're ready for departure. Kestrel advanced the throttles, feeling the twin General Electric TF-34 engines spin up to takeoff power. The aircraft began rolling forward, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as enemy reinforcements began arriving at the compound's outer perimeter. Muzzle flashes erupted from newly arrived vehicles as hostile forces engaged the departing aircraft. Takeoff from the confined courtyard required every technique she'd ever learned about short-field operations. Maximum power, minimum rotation speed, and a climb angle steep enough to clear the surrounding buildings. The A-10 lifted off with barely enough airspeed to remain controllable, clawing for altitude while carrying a human cargo it was never designed to transport. Banshee Actual, Control. Do you require medical support for the rescued personnel? Affirmative, Control. 2 wounded need immediate attention, requesting priority routing to nearest medical facility. But even as she spoke, Kestrel knew the mission wasn't over. The storm was still raging, visibility remained near zero, and she was flying an overloaded aircraft with external passengers exposed to the elements. Getting the SEALs out of the compound had been the easy part. Getting them home alive would require everything she had left. The flight back to base pushed both aircraft and pilot beyond all reasonable limits. Wind shears that had been challenging with a properly configured aircraft became life-threatening with the additional weight and altered aerodynamics. The 2 SEALs riding external hardpoints were exposed to hurricane-force winds and sub-freezing temperatures, while the wounded men in the cargo compartment needed medical attention she couldn't provide. But Kestrel had spent her career proving that impossible was just another word for difficult. She nursed the overloaded A-10 through weather that should have killed them all, using every trick of energy management and aircraft control she'd ever learned. When ice began forming on her control surfaces, she descended to warmer air. When turbulence threatened to shake the aircraft apart, she found smoother altitudes. When fuel consumption exceeded all reasonable parameters, she adjusted power settings to stretch every gallon. Control, Banshee Actual. Fuel state is critical. Request priority approach and emergency vehicles standing by. Roger, Banshee. Emergency services are positioned. Runway is clear and ready. The approach to base was anticlimactic after everything that had come before. Rain still hammered the runway, but compared to landing in a combat zone under fire, it felt routine. The A-10 touched down smoothly, and Kestrel taxied directly to the medical facility where ambulances were waiting. As the engines wound down and the external noise faded, she could hear Chief Rivera's voice from the wing hardpoint. Banshee Actual, that was the finest piece of flying I've ever seen. Thank you for bringing us home. Medical personnel swarmed the aircraft, extracting the wounded and treating those who had ridden external positions for hypothermia. But as Kestrel began her post-flight procedures, she could see Commander Morrison approaching across the flight line. His expression was unreadable, and she knew her unauthorized mission would have consequences. Morrison climbed onto the wing and looked down at the pilot who had just redefined what was possible in military aviation. Captain Kestrel Thorne sat in her ejection seat, exhausted but alert, still wearing the night vision goggles that had allowed her to navigate through the storm. Her call sign, Banshee, was painted below the cockpit rail in faded letters, and Morrison finally understood why she'd earned that particular designation. In Irish mythology, A banshee was a spirit who appeared to warn of impending death. But sometimes, if the old stories were true, she could be convinced to guide souls safely home instead. "Captain Thorne," Morrison said formally, "you are ordered to report for immediate debriefing." And Captain, "Yes, sir." That was either the most reckless flying I've ever witnessed or the most heroic, probably both. As news of the rescue spread throughout the military community, reactions ranged from incredulous disbelief to professional admiration. The tactical impossibility of what had been accomplished generated immediate interest from aviation analysts and military historians. But for the 8 Navy SEALs who had been extracted from certain death, the only thing that mattered was being alive to see another sunrise. In the days that followed, investigations would be launched, regulations would be reviewed, and careers would be evaluated. Captain Kestrel Thorne would face questions about unauthorized use of military aircraft, deviation from established procedures, and the assumption of command authority she didn't possess. Some would call her a reckless cowboy who had endangered lives through irresponsible actions. But in the special operations community, word traveled fast about the pilot who had flown into hell itself to bring their brothers home. They spoke of precision flying that had saved lives, tactical awareness that had outmatched ground controllers, and courage that had turned impossible odds into inevitable victory. They remembered that when everyone else said it couldn't be done, Banshee had simply done it. Chief Rivera visited Kestrel 3 days later as she waited for her disciplinary hearing. She was sitting in the squadron-ready room, studying technical manuals and trying not to think about the end of her military career. The conversation was brief but meaningful. "Captain, I wanted to thank you again for what you did out there." "Just doing my job, Chief." "No, ma'am. Your job was to stay grounded pending review. What you did was something else entirely." Rivera paused, choosing his words carefully. "My team and I have been in some tight spots over the years. We've been extracted by helicopters, ground vehicles, even fast boats once, but we've never seen anything like what you pulled off in that storm." Kestrel looked up from her manual. "How are your wounded doing?" "Full recovery expected for both. They'll be back with the team in 6 weeks." Rivera smiled slightly. "They keep asking me who Banshee Actual is. I told them she's the pilot who redefined what's possible when the mission matters more than the rules." The disciplinary hearing that followed was unlike anything in recent military justice history. Captain Thorne faced charges of unauthorized use of military aircraft, deviation from established flight procedures, and assumption of command authority during combat operations. The prosecution argued that her actions, while ultimately successful, had violated multiple regulations and established dangerous precedents for military discipline. The defense took a different approach. They argued that exceptional circumstances required exceptional measures, and that Captain Thorne's actions had been guided by the highest traditions of military service, the obligation to leave no one behind. They presented testimony from the rescued SEALs, analysis of the tactical situation, and expert witness statements about the impossibility of what had been accomplished. But the most compelling evidence came from the mission recordings themselves. Audio and video feeds from that night revealed not a reckless pilot seeking glory, but a professional aviator making calculated decisions under extreme pressure. Her communications had been clear and precise. Her tactical awareness had been superior to ground controllers working with better information, and her flying had been technically flawless despite impossible conditions. When Colonel Sarah Martinez, the hearing officer, announced her findings, she addressed not just the specific charges, but the broader questions raised by the case. "Captain Thorne, your actions on the night in question clearly violated established procedures and regulations. You took an aircraft without authorization, flew in weather conditions that grounded all other aviation assets, and engaged in combat operations without proper command approval. However, this hearing must also consider the results of those actions. 8 Navy SEALs are alive today because of your decision to ignore regulations in favor of a higher duty. Your flying demonstrated technical skill of the highest order, and your tactical decisions proved superior to those made by commanders with more complete information. Military discipline requires that we follow orders and obey regulations, but military honor requires that we protect those who serve alongside us. In this case, Captain Thorne, you chose honor over regulation, and 8 families still have their loved ones as a result. Therefore, this hearing finds you guilty of the charges as specified, but recommends that no punitive action be taken. Instead, you are hereby recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in aerial combat. The hearing room erupted in applause from the gallery, where members of Rivera's SEAL team and fellow pilots had gathered to show support. But Kestrel's reaction was more subdued. She'd known from the beginning that her career would likely end because of that night's mission, and official recognition couldn't change the fundamental questions about military authority and individual initiative that her actions had raised. Over the following months, Captain Kestrel Thorne became something of a reluctant celebrity within military aviation circles. Her call sign Banshee took on legendary status as the story spread throughout the community, embellished and retold until the facts became almost secondary to the myth. But those who knew her personally understood that the recognition made her uncomfortable, and that she would have preferred to let her actions speak for themselves. The A-10 she had flown that night was eventually retired from active service and placed in the National Museum of the United States Air Force. A small placard beside the aircraft told the story of the Banshee rescue, and thousands of visitors each year learned about the pilot who had redefined courage in military aviation. But the real legacy of that night wasn't found in museums or award citations. It was found in the lives that had been saved and the standards of excellence that had been established. Chief Rivera stayed in contact with Kestrel over the years, sending updates about his team's missions and his own advancement through the Special Operations community. When he was eventually promoted to Master Chief and assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command, one of his first initiatives was establishing new protocols for multi-service cooperation in combat search and rescue operations. The procedures became known informally as Banshee protocols, and they incorporated lessons learned from that impossible night in Afghanistan. For Kestrel herself, the path forward was less clear. The military offered her continued service in a training role, but the restrictions on her flight status made the position largely ceremonial. She could teach others to fly, but she would never again be trusted with combat operations. The irony wasn't lost on her that saving 8 lives had effectively ended her career as a combat pilot. But sometimes legacy takes unexpected forms. 3 years after the rescue, Kestrel received a letter from a young woman named Jessica Martinez, daughter of Colonel Martinez, who had presided over her disciplinary hearing. Jessica was applying to the Air Force Academy and had written her application essay about the pilot who showed me that doing the right thing sometimes means breaking the rules. The letter continued, "My mom told me about your case and how you chose to save lives instead of following regulations. She said that real leadership isn't about following orders. It's about knowing when something more important than orders is at stake. I want to be the kind of pilot who makes those decisions when they matter most." Jessica Martinez was accepted to the Air Force Academy that year, and she would eventually earn her wings as a combat pilot. During her training, instructors would tell the story of Banshee Actual as an example of tactical innovation under pressure. They would analyze her decision-making process, study her flying techniques, and discuss the ethical dimensions of choosing mission success over regulatory compliance. But for the students, the lesson was simpler and more profound. When American lives are on the line, impossible is just another word for challenging. The storm that had grounded all other aircraft that night became a metaphor in military aviation training. Instructors would refer to Banshee weather, when describing conditions that pushed equipment and personnel beyond normal limits. Student pilots learned that true airmanship wasn't just about following procedures. It was about knowing when circumstances demanded something more. Kestrel eventually transitioned out of active military service, but her influence on military aviation continued through the students she taught and the procedures she helped develop. The rescue techniques pioneered that night became standard training for special operations pilots, and the integration of close air support with personnel recovery operations evolved into new tactical doctrines. Years later, when military historians analyzed the evolution of 21st-century combat aviation, they would identify the Banshee rescue as a turning point in tactical thinking. It demonstrated that individual initiative, when guided by proper training and moral clarity, could achieve results that exceeded what was possible through conventional approaches. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to that night came from an unexpected source. During a ceremony honoring fallen Special Operations personnel, Chief Rivera, by then a Master Chief, was asked to speak about the values that defined America's elite military units. His remarks focused not on the warriors who had given their lives in combat, but on those who had risked everything to ensure that others could come home. The people we honor today understood that service means more than following orders, he said. It means being willing to make impossible decisions in impossible circumstances. Sometimes that means charging a machine gun position to save your squad. Sometimes it means flying into a storm that has grounded every other aircraft in theater. On a night when everyone said air power was done, one pilot proved them wrong. She didn't do it for glory or recognition or personal advancement. She did it because 8 Americans needed someone to show up, and she decided to be that someone. Rivera paused, looking out at the audience of military personnel and their families. In special operations, we have a saying, the only easy day was yesterday. But sometimes, when the mission seems impossible and the odds are stacked against us, we remember that voice on the radio saying, I can get them out. That's the voice of American military aviation at its finest. That's the spirit that turns impossible missions into inevitable victories. And that's why, when people ask me about heroes in combat, I tell them about the pilot who whispered the first order when everyone else said it was over. The audience remained silent for a moment after Rivera finished speaking, absorbing the weight of his words. Then, slowly, they began to applaud, not for the formal ceremony or official remarks, but for the memory of a night when one pilot had redefined what was possible in military service. In the years that followed, Kestrel Thorne would receive many honors and recognitions for her actions that night. She would be invited to